In the early winter chill of the Colorado mountains, a small wooden cabin stood alone on the edge of the forest, a place David Harper had chosen not as a refuge, but as a place to quietly fall apart. In his early 40s, the once solid face of a U.S. Marine was now weathered by years of sun, war, and sorrow. A rough, unshaven beard clung to his jaw. His eyes were sunken and hollow, and his skin had taken on the pale gray hue of someone who hadn't truly slept in years. David had served in Afghanistan, commanding a small unit during the brutal Helmand campaigns, a place where dust, blood, and gunfire blended into a haunting symphony that never truly ended. But the war had ended over a decade ago. For David, it wasn't the finish line, it was the starting point of a different kind of battle. A silent war fought inside his mind, against memories and ghosts that refused to stay buried. He left the Marines with medals, scars, and a soul that no one could see had shattered. And when his wife Elena left him, taking their only daughter Lila with her, the last fragile piece of him cracked beyond recognition. 3 years had passed since the divorce. David hadn't seen his daughter since. The courts had ruled him psychologically unfit, and Elena had quietly cut off all contact. In the cabin, it was only wind whistling through the cracks and the silhouette of a man slowly disappearing. The nights stretched endlessly. Sometimes, David couldn't tell if he was dreaming or remembering. There were nights he'd jolt upright, drenched in sweat, believing he was back in the trench, gunfire erupting at his ears. There were days he wouldn't speak a word, just staring out at the snow-covered woods, where no one came and nothing moved. Sedatives had become his crutch, the only way to grasp a few hours of dreamless sleep. A few sips of bourbon in the evening helped dull the emptiness in his chest. Then came the headaches, the numb mornings, and the same meaningless cycle. David existed like a ghost. No one visited, no one called. He demanded nothing from the world. In his mind, he had already died. The body just hadn't caught up yet, sentenced to drift in the ruins of something that used to be a life. And yet, deep in that frozen silence, something flickered. A faint, fragile ember hadn't been completely extinguished. He didn't know what it was, or whether it could lead him anywhere. But sometimes in the quietest part of the night, he heard a voice, soft, distant, maybe imagined. A call. And perhaps that call would be the beginning of a path he never believed he deserved, a path toward redemption. David Harper used to believe that survival was the same as living. That belief had kept him breathing through the worst of the Helmand campaign in Afghanistan, where each day was a coin toss between life and death. He had served as a staff sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps, leading a small recon unit across a region where the dust never settled and the silence before an ambush could stretch like a lifetime. Orders came fast and brutal. Mistakes came faster. There was one mission, a night raid outside San Jin, that never left him. It was supposed to be simple. Intel extraction, minimal contact. But the information was flawed. Insurgents had been waiting. The moment his team breached the compound, everything fell apart. The first explosion took out Ramirez. Gunfire ripped through the night like tearing fabric. One by one, they fell, his brothers, his responsibility, while David, bloodied and half-deaf, crawled out of the debris with nothing but a jammed radio and a shattered rib. Rescue came too late. By then, all he could do was stare at their bodies under the moonlight and wonder why he was still breathing. The guilt became his inheritance. He wore it like a second skin, invisible but suffocating. Every sound reminded him of those final screams, of the cold realization that he had made the wrong call. Even back in the U.S., the war never really ended. He buried it under silence, under forced smiles, under the illusion of moving on. But trauma isn't something you walk away from. It follows. He met Elena a year after his discharge, during one of his mandatory VA hospital visits. She was a nurse, kind-eyed, efficient, and warm in the way he no longer knew how to be. For a time, she became his anchor. They married after 6 months. On the surface, it looked like healing, a house, a steady job, the birth of their daughter Lila. But David never truly came home. His body was present, but his soul was still on the battlefield. And slowly, that darkness bled into the walls of their house. The nightmares came first, violent, guttural things that left him gasping at dawn. Then came the rage. Explosions over spilled coffee. Silence after every apology. Elena tried, God, she tried. But how do you hold someone who won't be touched? How do you love a man who looks through you as if you were a ghost? David's outbursts grew colder, more unpredictable. He would disappear for hours without warning, lost in some fog only he could see. He never struck her, but his anger lived in the slamming doors, the broken dishes, the quiet threats to himself that Elena pretended not to hear. Still, she stayed. For Lila. For hope. Until one night, 3 years ago, when hope finally died. They had fought again about something trivial that became something brutal. Words were flung like knives. David shouted, not even knowing what he was saying. When he turned around, Elena was gone. Not just from the room, but from his life. The next morning, she left the house with their 10-year-old daughter and never returned. A restraining order. A custody ruling. Silence. David hadn't seen Lila since. And in some part of him, he believed he deserved that. He had failed as men. He had failed as wife. He had failed as a father. Now, in the cabin, surrounded by cold wood and colder memories, all of it returned in fragments. Sights, sounds, regrets. The war, the love, the loss. They clung to him like frost on glass, always present, always just one breath away. He no longer knew what was real. The screaming in his ears, the laughter of a daughter now growing up without him, or the slow death happening in his own chest. And in that ruin, he drifted, a man untethered, spiraling toward a rock bottom he could neither name nor escape. The descent wasn't sudden. It was slow, almost imperceptible, like snow accumulating on a roof until it finally collapses under the weight. For David Harper, the silence after losing his daughter and wife had grown unbearable. Days blended into one another. He no longer kept track of time. Sometimes he would wake up on the floor of his cabin, unaware how he had gotten there, an empty bottle beside him and the dull throb of another hangover pulsing behind his eyes. The last text Elena had sent, "Please stop calling. This isn't healthy for anyone, especially Lila," played in his mind like a scratched record. After that, she changed her number. No photos, no updates, just emptiness. And so he drank, to forget, to sleep, to disappear, if only for a while. One evening, after downing half a bottle of bourbon and convincing himself he was fine enough to make a quick drive into town, David got behind the wheel of his pickup. Snow had begun to fall, visibility was low, and the curves of the mountain road were slick with ice. He didn't see the deer until it was too late. Swerving hard, he narrowly missed a tree and ended up in a shallow ditch, tires spinning, headlights tilted up toward the dark sky. The crash wasn't serious. No one was hurt, but the sheriff knew him. And this wasn't his first warning. The judge, perhaps out of mercy, perhaps out of frustration, assigned him community service and mandatory counseling sessions. "You're lucky, Harper," the sheriff had said, not unkindly. "Next time, it might be a kid crossing the road." 2 weeks later, while sweeping the sidewalk outside a grocery store as part of his service hours, David experienced his first full-blown panic attack in public. A helicopter flew overhead. Nothing unusual, but the sound jolted something buried deep in his chest. He dropped the broom. His vision tunneled. He couldn't breathe. He collapsed to his knees, clawing at his jacket as if trying to tear something off him. A small crowd gathered. Someone called 911. By the time the medics arrived, he was curled against the side of the building, eyes wild, mumbling coordinates and names that made no sense to anyone but him. They held him overnight at the local facility for observation. It was humiliating, but it also became a turning point. Under court order, David began mandatory therapy sessions. He didn't expect much, just another box to check before being left alone again. But then he met Dr. Maya Chun. She was calm without being cold, firm without judgment. At first, David sat in the chair across from her with his arms crossed, offering only silence or short, clipped answers. But she didn't push. She just waited. And slowly, over weeks, something began to shift. Maya shared, carefully and with discretion, that her older brother had served in Iraq and had come home a different man. "I don't pretend to know your pain," she said one afternoon, "but I've seen what it does. I've watched it swallow good people whole." That sentence stuck with David. He began to talk, haltingly, awkwardly, about the mission that went wrong, about the dreams that left him shaking, about the way Lila's laugh used to echo through the house like sunlight. Sometimes he cried and tried to hide it. Sometimes he got angry. But Maya never flinched. She listened. And for the first time in years, David began to feel like someone was truly seeing him. Not the broken soldier, not the failure, but the man still buried under the rubble. Maybe, just maybe, there was something worth salvaging after all. The recovery didn't happen all at once. It was slow, uneven, often frustrating. There were days David Harper wanted to quit, to disappear back into the bottle, to sleep until everything stopped hurting. But something had changed since the panic attack and his forced introduction to therapy. Dr. Maya Chun had helped him crack open the door, just enough to let some light in. Now it was up to him to decide whether to step through it. It began with a flyer pinned to the corkboard in the waiting room at the VA clinic. Veterans Peer Support Group. Thursdays at 6 p.m. For a week, he ignored it. Then another. But something about the bold letters nagged at him. On a cold Thursday evening, hands sweating and heart pounding, he showed up. The group met in a church basement. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Folding chairs circled around a chipped coffee table, holding styrofoam cups and lukewarm brew. At first, David sat in silence, barely making eye contact. The others talked, some angry, some grieving, some just tired. Men and women from different wars, different decades, bound by the same invisible wounds. One guy, a former Navy corpsman named Reggie, cracked jokes so dark they made everyone laugh and wince at the same time. Another, Maria, spoke of waking up screaming every night since Mosul. Over time, David started to speak too, tentatively at first, then with more clarity. The group didn't fix him, but it reminded him he wasn't alone. That was enough to keep him coming back. The physical healing came next. He laced up his old running shoes and started walking in the mornings, short, cautious steps down the trail behind his cabin. The cold mountain air bit into his lungs, but he liked that. It made him feel real again. Within a month, the walks turned into jogs. He poured the bourbon down the drain, flushed the sleeping pills. The first week without them was hell. Nights of sweating, tossing, whispering to ghosts. But he endured. Because this time he wanted to. And every Sunday, without fail, he wrote a letter to Lila. He didn't know where to send them, so he kept them in a shoebox beneath his bed. The first letters were desperate, clumsy apologies. Later, they became gentler, stories about the deer that wandered into his yard, about a book he was reading, about how he remembered her laugh. He didn't know if she would ever read them, but the act of writing grounded him. It reminded him he was still her father, even from a distance. Volunteering was Maya's idea. "You don't have to save the world, David," she'd said, "but helping someone else might help you too." He joined a local outreach program for at-risk veterans, driving supplies to shelters, speaking at schools, even just listening to those still too broken to speak. It was through that work that he met Tyler, 24, bright, sharp-witted, hiding his pain behind sarcasm and tattoos. They talked often. Tyler reminded David of himself at that age, before everything collapsed. Then one Friday morning, David got a call. Tyler was gone. Suicide. The news hit like a gut punch. For hours, David sat alone in his truck, staring at the steering wheel, numb. He thought about Ramirez. About the mission in Sanjin, about the night Elena left, about all the times he had nearly followed the same path as Tyler, and how close he had come to vanishing. That night, something inside him broke, or perhaps, finally, broke open. He pulled out a dusty notebook and began to write, not to Lila this time, but to the world. A record of the war, the guilt, the anger, the things no one ever told him to prepare for, the things he never dared speak aloud. He wrote to make sense of it, to keep others from making the same mistakes, to honor the ones who didn't make it home, and the ones who did, but came back broken. He titled it Ashes and Echoes. It wasn't for profit. It was for redemption. For the first time in years, David felt like he was building something, not from rubble, but from truth. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The leaves outside had turned to fire, amber, gold, deep rust, and the light filtering through the trees painted the cabin walls in soft, moving patterns. David had just returned from delivering supplies to a shelter downtown when the phone rang. He almost didn't answer. Unknown number. Could have been a telemarketer, a wrong dial. But something made him pick up. David. Her voice was cautious, familiar, like hearing an old song from a dream. It took him a second. Elena. A pause. Then, Lila wants to see you. He sat down slowly, heart thudding in his ears. It's been 3 years, Elena continued, her tone careful, deliberate. She's older now, different. She asked about you, more than once. I wasn't sure before, but she's ready. If you are. He couldn't speak. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. His hands trembled slightly on the kitchen table. Eventually, he forced out a whisper, yes. They agreed on the weekend. A quiet park by a lake halfway between their towns. Neutral ground. Public. Familiar. Safe. He arrived early, nerves buzzing like static beneath his skin. The sun hovered low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. Ducks glided by in lazy arcs. Children laughed in the distance. He stood by the lake's edge, watching the ripples, try to remember how to breathe. Then he saw her. She was taller now, a little more of Elena in her posture. But the way she tilted her head when she spotted him, wide-eyed and hesitant, was all Lila. She approached slowly, hands buried in the sleeves of her sweater, a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he echoed, his voice hoarse. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of lost years stretching between them. Then Lila looked up. "Mom said you write letters." "I did," he replied. "Every week. I didn't know where to send them, so I kept them all." Lila shifted her weight. "Can I read them?" His throat tightened. "Yeah, anytime. They're yours." A small smile flickered on her face. Not a full one. Not yet. But it was real. They sat on a bench overlooking the lake. The conversation came in fits and starts, safe topics at first. School, her friends, how tall she'd gotten. Then deeper ones. His volunteer work, the nightmares that still visited him sometimes, the book he'd written. He didn't sugarcoat things, but he didn't overwhelm her either. He spoke carefully, truthfully. At one point, Lila asked, "Are you better now?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "I'm healing. That's not the same as better, but it's something." She nodded, eyes scanning the water. "I missed you. Even when I was mad, I still missed you." A lump rose in his throat. He reached out slowly, unsure, and she didn't pull away when his hand brushed hers. They sat like that as the light began to fade. Later, as the wind picked up and the sky turned pink with dusk, they stood and began walking along the lakeshore. They didn't talk much, just the crunch of leaves underfoot, the quiet rhythm of 2 sets of footsteps moving side by side. Lila occasionally glanced up at him. Once, she even laughed, soft, surprised, at something he said. David didn't need a grand reunion. He didn't expect forgiveness all at once. This wasn't about fixing everything. It was about showing up, being present, building again one moment at a time. As they walked further down the path, framed by golden trees and fading light, David felt something loosen inside him. The grief was still there, So was the guilt. But now there was something else, too. Hope. Not loud, not triumphant, but steady, quiet, like the sound of fallen leaves beneath steady footsteps. Life is never a straight path, especially for those who have faced loss, pain, and deep personal struggles. The story of David Harper, a former soldier who hit rock bottom, lost his family, and wrestled with a traumatic past, reminds us that no matter how deep the darkness, there's always a way toward the light if we have the courage to seek and follow it. What truly matters is not how many times you fall, but how many times you get back up. Healing and rebirth don't happen overnight. They require time, patience, and faith in oneself. Sometimes help from others, a support group, a trusted friend, or a professional can be the key that opens the door to hope. David's journey of rediscovering purpose through sharing his story, connecting with others, and embracing community shows us the power of vulnerability and courage in facing our past. It's a reminder that healing is not just personal, but can inspire and uplift those around us. Finally, this story teaches the value of connection, whether with family, loved ones, or oneself. Forgiveness, even if it doesn't come immediately, is often the first step toward rebuilding trust and love. Opening our hearts to others means allowing ourselves to live more fully and authentically. Remember, healing is not a destination, but a journey, and hope is the light that guides us along the way.